Hey everybody, I'm Tom Vasel, here with the Dice Tower, and I'm talking to you today, publishers. I have a plea for you, please. Well, actually, I might do this for more than one video. But today I want to talk to publishers, or anyone considering publishing a game, or maybe to people who just want to commiserate with me, about rule books, rules, and just the written stuff that comes with games. And I think it's really important that this is part of games. I love playing board games. I have played thousands of different games. I have read thousands of different rule sets. And in fact, I've written a couple rule sets in my life, and I'm terrible at it. I don't recommend hiring me to write a rule book. But that doesn't mean that I can't recognize a good one when I see it. And because I am sure that if you polled everybody who plays games in the world and said, what's the worst thing about playing games? The rule book would be very high, if not the highest thing on the list. But there are so many obvious things that I am still kind of numb that it's just not done. And I realize, sometimes that playing a game is work, and the rule book is the biggest hurdle to get into a new game. So let's make it easier for people. So we're going to take a look here today at some things that I think should be in every game. Every game, no excuse. But mostly what we want to talk about here is when you write a rule book, you need to assume that people are dummies. Now, I don't mean that people are really dummies, but we should expect great things from our children. We should have high expectations for our employees, for our students. I don't think we should have such high expectations for our consumers. Just assume people don't know what's going on. There are many things in the world I don't know anything about. So if you tell me to do something with that, let's say you give me an instruction book on how to fix my car, well, you better make that as clear as day for me because I don't know much about the subject. And even if I do know enough about the subject, I don't want there to be any misconceptions. And why wouldn't we want to make things easier? Usually when someone will say, this rule book was very hard to go through and understand, someone else can say, I didn't have a problem with it, but we all can agree when it's a fantastic rule book. So here are some thoughts I think should be in every game. First of all, player aids. Yes, the Dice Tower bangs this drum all the time, and we will never apologize for it. Your game probably needs player aids. Not every game needs player aids, but a lot do. If your game needs player aids, then put enough in for all the players. And every time we mention this, people say, well, you don't really need player aids for every player. But why not? Why wouldn't you do that? It's like going to a restaurant and there's 4 of you at the table and they hand you 2 menus. Yes, it's functional, but you're making it harder for people deliberately. And the player aids need to be comprehensive. Player aids that don't give enough information, or if you're not sure, you're like, I don't know if we should use a player aid. The answer is always yes. What's the worst? You have a couple extra sheets that you don't use that you put in the box, but player aids can be very, very helpful, especially when people are learning a game. All right, if your rule book is long enough, and this is a little bit more hazy, but you need an index. And if you have to question if you need an index or not, you need an index. Indices are very important because I might have a question about a rule and I might not know where it is in the rule book. I can look it up there and it will tell me where it is. Also, what should a rule book cover in your game? Here's the answer for that. Everything. You really should. You should cover everything. You don't need to wait till later or stick something at the end. You need to explain everything. And you should not ever assume that somebody knows what deck building means or what tableau is. You shouldn't even assume that people know terms that a lot of gamers use like orthogonal. Well, if I've never played a board game before, I may have never run across that word in my life. Rules should be clearly explained. And you know what? It's okay if you do it more than once. It can be very frustrating when you read a rule book and there's a very important rule that's hidden off in a corner somewhere. And this kind of brings me to my next thing. Rules need to make sense in their order. You should start by saying, this is what the object of the game is. I'm still kind of mind-boggled when I don't see that in games. You start out I mean, if you've ever done any kind of writing, they tell you at the beginning of your speech or whatever it is, you give your summary. And then at the end, you give your summary again. Here, this is what you're trying to accomplish in this game. But the rules should make sense in their order. I've seen games where they talk about concept after concept after concept and other things, and then setup is on page 8. That is not how games work. You show the setup, you give the overall thing, you go through. And why not stick concepts of a game in the section that matters? Many games these days, it seems to be a trend where they'll teach you concepts of the game, and you sit there going, I don't know what any of this means. And then you read through the rules, and you have to go flip back and forth. Flipping back and forth through a rule book makes no sense. Sometimes you have to do it. You can't put all the rules together, but again, it's not a bad idea necessarily to have rules in multiple places. Rules should have examples. Again, I always laugh when I play a game, let's say a polyomino game where you're placing Tetris-type tiles on a board. And it will say things like, you can't go off the edge of the board. You can't go, they have to fit in the squares. You can't go on top of another piece. And I say, this is all very obvious. Yeah, it is all very obvious. And yet, show that in your examples, because there might be someone who doesn't get the quote-unquote obvious. And you can show edge cases. I hate when there's an example in a rule book and I'm like, well, they just showed the most basic thing. But there's this other possibility. Why didn't they show that? Because now I don't know. But also, examples shouldn't contain rules. If something is so important that you use it in an example to show that you cannot do it, you should also spell it out in the rule book. You should show the components at the beginning of a rule book. It's, to me, a bit insane when I open up a game and I get all these pieces and I don't know what they are. If you want me to shuffle the Valupa deck and mix it with the Wacho deck, and I don't know which is which, you shouldn't assume that at the beginning. There should be some pages that show all the components and say exactly what they're called. And then on top of that, when you do setup, you should show a picture of the setup. Not just say what to do, show a picture with it. Some rule books are great at this. They are numbered. Number 1, put the board in the middle of the table. Number 2, put this card deck here. I look there, it's there. If I don't know what card deck Fulumakaba is, I can look back at the first page and know there's the Fulumakaba deck, and I now know what it looks like. Very, very helpful. And then also in the components at the beginning of the game and the setup, if there are things that you do not need, solo components or Kickstarter extra components or whatever they might be, those should be listed at the front of the rule book and say what they're for. This deck of cards for the solo campaign. This deck of cards, extra stuff we added for a Kickstarter variant. Because there's nothing more frustrating than sending things up and going, what are these pieces? What are they? And sometimes you flip to the back of the rule book and the solo rules and they go, here's the solo stuff, and they show you the solo things. I'm like, you should have told me that at the beginning because I was sitting around trying to figure out what deck went where. Also, and this matters especially for companies who make those wonderful, terrific inserts that hold everything beautifully. Show me how it goes back in that insert. And I think this is very, very important. You, again, this comes back to assuming people are dummies, but also assuming people don't have access to everything ever. Many times when I talk about this stuff and I'll say there's this, I don't know how to put anything back in, they'll say, well, was it update 37 of the Kickstarter? I didn't come to the game night with update 37 of the Kickstarter printed out. I don't even know that I need to know to go there. Why, again, not put it in a game and show me what goes there? And speaking of quality life, and this is something that I love when publishers do, there's a lot of punch boards that there are extra things that you don't need. And I'll compare them to the component list, but it's nice if you put a little marker, a trash can, or a red X on these pieces to know that I can throw them away. So showing all this stuff, having pictures in your rulebook is really important. Other things to mention. If at the beginning of the game, you are requiring players to pick something, draw 7 cards, keep 3. Huh? This is an important decision that I don't know. I don't know what to do. Why not make it easier? Have some sets of starting cards for people to pick. I love when games do that. They'll say, okay, for your first game, you don't know what you're doing, pick these 4 things. That's very, very helpful. And if there's a great way to play your game, the best way to play your game, don't put it as a variant at the end. If someone later on goes, I didn't like this about the game, you're like, well, really, the best way to play is this variant at the end. If it's the best way to play, then put it in the main rule book. And FAQs and strategy tips, things may seem obvious, but why not put them in the book? It's great when there's strategy tips. People are playing the first time. I'll say, hey, the rule book suggests that you do this and this. I know you have 10 different actions to pick from on turn 1. These are the actions that we recommend. And then just some basic general stuff. Legibility and usability is important. Rulebook size. Yes, nowadays lots of games are big square boxes. The rulebook does not need to be big and square. People don't read books that are that size. People read books that are smaller. Why not make the rulebook smaller? I talked to someone one time who told me, hey, that's because the rulebook might bounce around the box and then people get upset over the corners bouncing. But that can't be correct because there's lots of small pieces. There's lots of player aids and other things in a box that could also bounce around. Make the rulebook one that a human person can hold, because you're going to have that rule book open during the game a lot, and when it's open and it's giant, it's hard to move around. Also, if you're unfolding a map rule book, they're the worst, and you're flipping it over trying to find the right spot. But it's not just the size, it's the size of the font. You should be able to read your rule book. I should be able to see it and not have to squint or be 18 years old to see the font. And also think about the type of font. It might be really cool, but can we read it? Think about the colors. You might think it's fantastic that your rulebook has pictures of planets in the background of everything, and we're going to do white font on top of that. And everyone else is sitting there just struggling through reading it. It looking cool shouldn't be more important than the usability and being able to read it. And then finally, you have other places to put rules. If you have a board, use it. Be smart. Hire a graphic designer who can show you where you can put helpful rules tips on the board somewhere. You got extra space in the back of the rule book? Put rules there. Again, utilizing player aids. But make it as easy for players as possible. I know that there's a contingent of players out there who love to have the pompous arrogance of saying, I don't need all this extra stuff. Once you learn the game, it's locked in the vault and I can play it. But again, the rest of us are dummies, and we would love every bit of helping hands along the way. Take a look at textbooks, the good textbooks, the textbooks that are used by the best teachers in the nation. Take a look at technical manuals that are well written and use them to make the rule book something that is welcoming, enjoyable, and helps us learn the game, not something that is a hindrance or something that we don't enjoy. So that's my plea. There are many, many companies out there making fantastic rule books, but there are many, 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 many more that are not. And I constantly play good games that are hampered by the rules and just some of these minor things there. I want you to make the quality of my gaming life better. Please? That's my plea. I'm Tom Vasel, and you've been watching The Dice Tower.